Welcome, my dear friends. This is a class on simplification of proposition, HS first year, logic and philosophy. Today, we shall try to communicate simplification of proposition, that is, how to transform ordinary sentences into proper logical propositions. Last class I discussed about fourfold scheme of propositions. Fourfold scheme of propositions. Let us remember the contents of our previous classes. Proposition. A proposition is the statement of a certain relation between two terms. Proposition is called the unit of logic. Parts of a proposition. A sentence has two parts. However, a proposition has three parts. Three parts of a proposition are two terms and a sign of relation between two terms. Nature of copula. Copula is not a term. It is a sign of relation between two terms, that is subject term and predicate term. Copula expresses affirmative or negative relation between two terms. In other words, copula expresses the relation of agreement or disagreement between two concepts or between subject term and predicate term of a logical proposition. Copula is always the present tense form of the verb to be and may be either affirmative or negative. So the nature of copula, present tense form of the verb to be and may be either affirmative or negative. Propositions according to quantity. According to quantity, propositions are of two kinds: universal proposition and particular proposition. Propositions according to quality. According to quality, propositions are of two kinds: affirmative proposition and negative proposition. Propositions according to both quantity and quality, that is fourfold scheme of proposition. According to both quantity and quality, propositions are of four kinds: universal affirmative proposition, universal negative proposition, particular affirmative proposition, and particular negative proposition. Capital letter A is the symbol of a universal affirmative proposition. All S is P is the logical form of a universal affirmative proposition. For example, all men are mortal. All men are mortal is a universal affirmative proposition. Capital letter E is the symbol of a universal negative proposition. Capital letter E is the symbol of a universal negative proposition. No S is P is the logical form of a universal negative proposition. No man is perfect is the example of a universal negative proposition. Particular affirmative proposition. Capital letter I is the symbol of a particular affirmative proposition. Some S is P is the logical form of a particular affirmative proposition. Some students are industrious is the example of a particular affirmative proposition. Particular negative proposition. Capital letter O is the symbol of a particular negative proposition. Some S is not P is the logical form of a particular negative proposition. Some students are not industrious is the example of a particular negative proposition. We use the word all to denote universal quantity. We use the word some to denote particular quantity. Is or are represents affirmative copula. Is or are represents affirmative copula. Is not or are not represents negative copula. Is not or are not represents negative copula. Capital letter S represents subject term of a logical proposition. Capital letter P represents predicate term of a logical proposition. Let us try to understand basic differences between an ordinary sentence and a logical proposition. Jevons says, what the logician calls a proposition, the grammarian calls a sentence. However, there are some important points of differences between a grammatical sentence and a logical proposition. In English grammar, a sentence is a combination of words conveying a definite meaning. In logic, a proposition is defined as the statement of a certain relation between two terms, namely subject term and predicate term. Though every logical proposition is a grammatical sentence, every sentence is not a logical proposition. Let us try to understand the differences between a sentence and a proposition regarding parts, copula, tense, quantity and quality, and value. Regarding parts, a proposition must consist of three parts. The three parts of a proposition are the subject, the copula, and the predicate. However, a sentence has only two parts, the subject and the predicate. So the basic difference between a sentence and a proposition is that a sentence has two parts and a proposition has three parts. Let us try to understand the difference between a sentence and a proposition regarding copula. A proposition is the statement of a certain relation between two terms, and this relation is expressed by the copula. There are three parts in a proposition. Copula establishes the relation of agreement or disagreement between two terms of a proposition. That means copula establishes affirmative or negative relation between two terms of a proposition. So copula is not a term. It is a sign of affirmative or negative relation between two terms. The copula has an independent existence in a proposition. So copula is a part of a logical proposition. However, a sentence does not necessarily require a copula. A sentence has two parts, subject and predicate. Copula is the predicate part of a sentence. So, copula has no independent existence in a sentence. Now let us try to understand the difference between a sentence and a proposition regarding tense. A grammatical sentence may be used in any tense, past, present, or future. For example, Ram was absent in the class. Shita will attend the meeting tomorrow. Now, if we remember the nature of copula, we find that the copula is the present tense form of the verb to be and may be either affirmative or negative. That means am is, are, am not, is not, or are not is called a copula. So a logical proposition must always be used in the present tense. Copula of a proposition is of the verb to be in the present tense only. However, a sentence can be of any verb in any tense. Now let us try to understand the difference between a sentence and a proposition regarding quantity and quality. In a grammatical sentence, we need not mention the quality and the quantity. For example, man is mortal, rose is red. However, in every logical proposition, we must mention the quantity and the quality, such as all men are mortal, some roses are red. According to quantity, propositions are of two kinds: universal proposition and particular proposition. According to quality, propositions are of two kinds: affirmative proposition and negative proposition. According to both quantity and quality, propositions are of four kinds: universal affirmative proposition, universal negative proposition, particular affirmative proposition, and particular negative proposition. In grammar, various kinds of sentences are recognized. However, only the sentences in the indicative mode are used as logical propositions. Now let us try to understand the difference between a sentence and a proposition regarding value. A proposition expresses the relation of agreement or disagreement between two concepts or between two terms of a logical proposition. So, a proposition is logically either true or false. A proposition is either true or false. Truth or falsity of a proposition is called truth value. However, a sentence is grammatically either correct or incorrect. Now let us try to understand simplification of proposition. Simplification of proposition means reduction or transformation of ordinary sentences into strict logical forms. Traditional logicians recognized only four typical forms of propositions in logic: universal affirmative proposition, universal negative proposition, particular affirmative proposition, and particular negative proposition. Capital letter A is the symbol of universal affirmative proposition. All S is P is the strict logical form of universal affirmative proposition. Capital letter E is the symbol of a universal negative proposition. No S is P is the strict logical form of a universal negative proposition. Capital letter I is the symbol of a particular affirmative proposition. Sum S is P is the strict logical form of a particular affirmative proposition. Capital letter O is the symbol of a particular negative proposition. Sum S is not P is the logical form of a particular negative proposition. Sentences which we generally use to express our thoughts are not always in the strict logical forms. Transformation of an ordinary sentence into any one of four logical forms, four typical forms, is known as simplification of proposition. In transforming a sentence into a proposition, our attention is to be drawn to the meaning of a sentence and not to its mere form. The original meaning of the sentence should not be altered. It must remain the same. For example, all roses are not red. All roses are not red. We have four typical forms: all S is P, no S is P, some S is P, some S is not P. The sentence all roses are not red contains all and negative particle not. The logical form of an A proposition is all S is P. There is no such form or structure with all and negative particle not. That means all S is not P. There is no such typical form. So all roses are not red cannot be treated as a proper logical proposition, or all S is not P cannot be treated as a proper logical form. The sentence all roses are not red means that some roses are not red, that is some S is not P. The logical form of a proposition is some S is not P. So we have a proposition with negative particle not. So we have a proposition with particular quantity sum and negative particle not. Now we are to transform the sentence all roses are not red into a proposition. Some S is not P. Some roses are not red. If we transform the sentence all roses are not red into some roses are not red, then the original meaning of the sentence remains the same. Transformation of all roses are not red into some roses are not red is called simplification of proposition. Similarly, each man is mortal is an ordinary English sentence. It is obvious that the sentence each man is mortal does not resemble the form of a proposition all S is P. So we are to transform each man is mortal into all S is P. All men are mortal. Transformation of each man is mortal into all men are mortal is called simplification of proposition. Let us try to understand rules of simplification. There are certain rules regarding simplification of proposition. We are to transform ordinary sentences into strict logical forms. or logical propositions following these rules. Rule 1. Sentences with all, every, each, any, everybody, anybody, each one, anyone, whoever, whenever, wherever, always, necessarily, invariably, everywhere, etc. are to be treated as either a or o propositions. A sentence with a word of rule 1 is to be treated as either a or o proposition. There are 4 typical forms: A. All S is P, E. No S is P, I. Some S is P, O. Some S is not P. A sentence with a word of rule 1 is to be treated as either A or O. Either A or O. So rule 1 is a conditional rule. Rule 1 is a conditional rule. Let us try to understand conditions. A sentence with a word of rule 1 and without negation sign. Without negation sign means without negative particle not is to be treated as an a proposition, and it will be transformed into all S is P. A sentence with a word of rule 1 and with negation sign. With negation sign means with negative particle not is to be treated as an O proposition, and it will be transformed into some S is not P. For example, each man is mortal. Each man is mortal is an English sentence. There is a word each of rule 1, each, and without negation sign, without negative particle not. So this sentence is each without negation sign. This sentence is to be treated as an a proposition, and it will be transformed into all S is P. So logical form A, all S is P. A proposition, all men, each singular, so a man men, all plural, so a me and men. Men singular, subject singular, so verb is, a me and men plural, so verb are. All men are mortal. Consider another example. All snakes are not poisonous. There is no form like all S is not P. All S is not P. There is no form like all snakes are not poisonous. This sentence contains a word of the rule 1, all, and with negation sign, with negative particle not. So all snakes are not poisonous, all with negation sign. A sentence with a word of rule 1 and with negation sign is to be treated as an O proposition. So we have to transform it into O proposition, and its form will be some S is not P. So some snakes are not poisonous. All snakes are not poisonous. Ordinary English sentence. Some snakes are not poisonous is also an English sentence. However, this sentence is in the form of an O proposition. Some S is not P. So, some snakes are not poisonous is a logical proposition. Simplification Rule 2. Sentences with no, never, none, no one, not a single, nothing, nowhere, by no means, etc. are to be treated as E propositions. A sentence with a word of Rule 2 is to be treated as an E proposition. There are 4 typical forms A, E, I, O. A sentence with a word of Rule 2 is to be treated as an E proposition. No S is P. For example, men are never truly happy. Men are never truly happy. In this sentence, there is a word never of Rule 2, never. So, this sentence is with a word of Rule 2. This sentence will be treated as an E proposition. Logical form E. No S is P. No men are truly happy. So, a sentence with a word of Rule 2 is to be treated as an E proposition. 15 ordinary sentences have been placed in this slide. You just try to reduce the following sentences into proper logical propositions. Every mother is kind-hearted. There is a word every of Rule 1 without negation sign. Every without negation sign. So this sentence is to be treated as an A proposition. You just try to transform this sentence into logical form all S is P. Learned are honored everywhere. There is a word everywhere of Rule 1 without negation sign. So this sentence is to be treated as an A proposition. Men are not necessarily bad. There is a word of Rule 1 necessarily with negative particle not. So Rule 1 necessarily with negation sign. This sentence is to be treated as an O proposition. This sentence will be transformed into some S is not P. All who praise are not friends. There is a word of Rule 1 all with negative particle not. So Rule 1 with negation sign. This sentence is to be treated as an O proposition and its logical form will be some S is not P. Not a single member is absent. Not a single, Rule 2. So this sentence is to be treated as an E proposition and its logical form will be no S is P. Similarly, you try to reduce 15 sentences into their proper logical forms. That means proper logical propositions.